So Basic Education Minister Siphiwe Kwagube has warned that budget cuts are putting teacher jobs in jeopardy, saying she plans to approach the finance minister over the issue. Meanwhile, the South African Democratic Teachers Union has vowed to fight any austerity measures. This came out of SADC's 10th National Congress, which is entering day 2 in Boksburg.
SADC is very much worried about the budget cuts, and we've been very clear that education is an investment for the nation, and therefore any budget cuts impact negatively on our children, on our future as a country. And what has been happening all along, it is that since 2020, we have seen, when we're dealing with COVID, at a very critical point where we have really been asked as education to really cut the budget. We have seen departments being requested to really release a lot of money, billions and billions, into the coffers instead of really investing in education. So what has been happening is that province by province are not able to honor and afford those particular post baskets that are there, meaning that when a teacher is not well, and your child is in the classroom, will not have a substitute. That is what it means. What it means basically it is that when there's an increase in numbers, as we are registering our children in January, it means your children will not have a teacher because they don't have a budget. Because what is happening is that the Treasury has been for a considerable time been cutting the budget since 2020 and so forth. So we as SADC don't accept it, and we believe that the government has got to revisit that particular policy, because we believe that if we want economic growth in this country, we must spend money on the skills. We must spend money in supporting our teachers and our colleges so that we're able to create that particular and or build that particular scale. So this is something that SADC is going to be reflecting in this particular Congress about the budget cuts, and therefore we are also going to launch on Friday what we call a Go Public Fund Education campaign, where we are saying down with austerity measures and how we are going to develop a program moving forward.
All right, let's make sense of all of this for you. Bring in our guest, education analyst Professor Metcalfe is with us via our video link. Also joining us is Basil Manuel. He's Executive Director of the National Professional Teachers Organization of South Africa. That's NAPTOSA. To both our guests, it's lovely to have you on the SABC News Channel. Thanks very much indeed for making time. So yesterday, in that briefing from the Basic Education Minister, Siphiwe Kwagube essentially put the crisis down to factors outside of the department. You know, she spoke about poor economic growth for quite some time, and poor spending patterns from national government and other departments. I wonder, Professor Metcalfe, if I can start with you, whether you reckon that's where the story starts and ends.
These touch on major issues that are going to affect the whole of government. And that's firstly that we're not getting the level of economic growth that to generate the tax revenues to do as much as is needed in the public sector. So what that means for education is that there is going to be a declining budget, and it is going to affect different provinces differently. And the challenge then for teachers, for provincial departments, is how we can create greater efficiencies and more careful prioritization of what we do with the available budget.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I was going to next. According to Section 27, they're a civil society organization in the education space. About 300 billion rand is spent on education in this country. That apparently comes to about 23,000 rand per pupil in a year. I wonder if you can help us kind of place that into context, Basil Manuel. I mean, for one, are we spending this money as efficiently as we can before we start essentially speaking about getting more?
Ayanda, that's not so easily answered, of course, because the measurement is relatively simplistic. When you consider what all has to be paid for out of that 23,000 that's dedicated to a child, and included in that are the core things, ensuring that the curriculum is delivered, and that goes to teachers, and that goes to assistant staff, etc. But it also goes to infrastructure and all the other things that are not seen as core, but with which the department cannot cope without. And some of these things are not actually owned to the Department of Education. They should be provided by other departments. However, given efficiencies as they are, it is easier to provide them within the department. We've started this discussion about what is core and what is not core. And quite honestly, when you look at, take the feeding scheme, which is not a core, but it's an essential. We wouldn't like to see feeding schemes and the like cut. So when you start whittling it down, actually the amount becomes far less. Are we getting bang for our buck? I believe that it's an improving and target. I don't believe we're at the best, but I think we are getting there. But the opposite, when you start cutting, then all those gains start whittling away again. And then how do you crawl all the way back again to where you've been?
Yeah, I find that question so fascinating. What is core and what is not core in something as crucial as the education sector? I mean, even if we were to think about, for example, which personnel you were to reduce, quite frankly, I'm not sure where to start, because I'm sure, Prof, you'll agree with me that teachers in the classroom are as important as administrative staff, for example, sitting in an office of an educational institution.
Both are important, and we need to understand that in terms of the education spend, and again, it varies across provinces, but we're spending 76% on average of the total spend on personnel. That means teachers and office-based. Now, I think that there may be room for discussion on efficiencies in both. At the moment, many provinces are just freezing office-based posts, which may be a false economy. And I think freezing means that you don't fill necessary posts, but there needs to be a critical review of priorities within the administration and to focus on filling those posts which have the most impact on supporting teachers, on improving teaching and learning. Within the way that we use the available teachers, we have been expanding subject choice post grade 9 to the extent that we have many classes that are fairly small because they're not subjects taken by many. Whereas in the primary schools and in foundation phase in particular, the greatest burden is carried in terms of large class sizes. And again, that's a false economy because we're not building the basics for quality education. So the way the law is written, once the budget is set, the individual MECs need to consult with teacher unions, teacher representatives, in terms of the distribution of posts. And I think that the unions can play a very constructive role there in assisting to focus on priorities and making sure that the distribution of resources best supports improved teaching and learning.
Basil, do you agree with that? You know, that there's a false economy in many respects, at least when we think about how we spread out the teachers that we do have?
Certainly, I will agree with Mary. First of all, to look at district offices being hollowed out and the support structure not being there, because we are not actually looking at what is essential. But also within the teaching framework itself, we do need to do more at the bottom. At the same time, and this is where we will have, I don't think we'll have a difference on it, but I'm putting it a little differently. At the same time, we need to introduce into the system those subjects that are going to allow us to be catering for a greater number of our children. The academic nature of our curriculum means that those children who are not academic are actually excluded. That's why we're losing 40% of our children between grade 1 and matric. So we need to be bringing them in. But to do that, you need teachers. You need teachers who can do the vocational, do the technical teaching, etc. It is absolutely essential. We need to be bringing in subjects for the 21st century economy. We talk a lot, and we are actually, we have this whole bragging thing about coding and robotics. It's an essential. but it's stillborn if in fact we don't have the teachers to do that. But more importantly, grade R, now that we have the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, and grade R is part of the compulsory schooling phase, we have to do something to be able to afford that. So we've got to go back to the drawing board, and we've got to fight harder for a more equitable distribution, noting that, yes, you will have this triangular shape of distribution where at the top you have fewer people in classes because it's the nature of things, but we do need to attend to the basics at the bottom. Our foundation has to be strengthened, and that is a big task for us to do.
Sure. These, at least from where I'm standing, sound like mammoth tasks in a context where we don't seem to have a lot of time. I mean, Sivuyo Kwahube yesterday said by, I think it's the year 2028, 4 years from now, 7 provinces in the country won't be able to sustain their budgets, which is not a long time at all. Professor Metcalfe, where do we start if we are to catch up with that?
We have to take a long-term view. And it's very useful to have the projections in terms of the budget going forward. In doing that long-term planning, one of the issues where I want to have a discussion with Basil with you is the question of the subjects that are offered after grade 9. What we have is a qualification in the basic education system, National Senior Certificate, and an equivalent set of qualifications in the post-school system. Now, I think that we need to take a broader view of education and make sure that we offer the best learning opportunities to learners who do not want to proceed to grade 12 for the matric university access, but are prepared to do the various courses that Basil is talking about, the skills. In TVETs, which need to have their quality improved, as well as community colleges. But at the moment, I think we have a costly duplication across the grades 10 and up sectors. So a long-term view, and that includes grade R. Provinces should be able to demonstrate that they have budgeted for and are ready to implement compulsory grade R.
It's an interesting proposition because I can imagine a lot of parents, for example, not necessarily being in favor of the concept of opting for, some kind of grade 9 qualification over the NSC. But perhaps it is a discussion worth having, Basil.
Yes, certainly it is. And NAPTOSA has been one of those that has been fighting for this idea of the grade 9 qualification. And remember, it's been around for a long, long time. Right. We just haven't implemented it. It's more than 20 years that we've been talking about this. And of course, now it's coming closer to fruition, and it's not a bad idea because we must understand it is not necessarily an exit from education, but it's a streaming and allowing yourself to make real and good choices. Parents have dreams, and sometimes their dreams are out of touch with the reality of their children. And so we find children that are placed in wrong areas, etc. And if we had a system where we tested properly so that we could say, okay, this is what you are delivering, and this is where you ought to be looking, I think parents would be more comfortable, and so too would children. The worst thing is when a child sits lower and lower in their chair because they don't want to be noticed, because they are at a loss with what is happening in the class. That's the worst type of situation we can place a child in. And hopefully this will help solve it. But it's a debate that we must have. And we have got to move away from this idea that matric in a formal schooling setup is the only way to do it. And come hell or high water, if my child isn't there, then she's a lesser being. It can't be so.
Yeah, it seems to me that this is not just about the rands and cents, but perhaps even a cultural kind of paradigm shift that needs to take place. Basil, Manuel, Professor Mary Metcalfe, always a pleasure. Thanks very much indeed for helping us think through these sometimes very complex issues. Basil Manuel is with NAPTOSA, that's a teachers union, and of course, Professor Mary Metcalfe, an education analyst. Once again, thanks very much indeed.